I can hear the fluorescent light buzz over the conference table, a cold, insect hum that sits right behind my eyes. It's 3:11 a.m., and the glass walls of the 11th floor war room hold the city like a snow globe, fog and sodium streetlights, a janitor pushing a cart across an empty lobby below. My phone glows face down. 2 more emails from the exchange. One from a senator's staffer with the subject line concerns. One from my mother, who sends an emoji she believes is a candle but looks like a baguette. I rub the groove in my palm where a pencil used to press when I was 12 and still believed you could think your way out of anything if you just stayed up long enough. Naomi, my general counsel, drops a stack of printouts next to a cold mug and says, "Evan, we need to make a call." She doesn't sit. She never sits when the answer might bend history. Outside, sirens thread the night. Inside, the HVAC breathes an even, indifferent breath. I look at the line on the page that will decide whether we go public at sunrise or pull the cord and detonate our own parade. The room smells like toner and stale coffee. My thumb hovers over a 5-word reply that could make a decade vanish. The first money I ever saw that wasn't coins lived under a rubber band in my father's toolbox, neatly folded tins so thin you could see George's eye through the paper. He kept the box in the laundry room, next to the dryer that squealed when the belt slipped. Ohio winters smelled like wet mittens and road salt. I used to slide on socks across the linoleum while the washing machine coughed into its spin cycle. Dad would come home from second shift at the stamping plant, knuckles silvered with aluminum dust, and say, "You learn how a hinge works, you understand a door." He meant, small parts change the big thing. He also meant, it's okay to be a person who stares at the hinge. My hinge was the beige tower PC on a rickety desk in the basement. The CRT hummed like it was thinking, and when it warmed, the smell of hot plastic and dust felt like a secret handshake. AOL came in a sleeve of coasters nobody asked for. I learned the stutter of a 56K handshake the way other kids learned bird calls. We couldn't afford new parts, so I scavenged. Mrs. Shipley on Cedar threw out an inkjet. The school dumped keyboards with sticky F keys that told the story of 1,000 rushed book reports. I took them apart until the screws rolled away and my mother yelled from upstairs, "Evan, we're not a repair shop," and then apologized because she was tired and because she was, in fact, grateful when I fixed the microwave's keypad with aluminum tape. I sold my first thing at a church rummage, a rebuilt router still hot from a hairdryer I'd used to soften the adhesive. A guy named Terry with an expression like a permanent wince counted out $40, then surprised me with 2 more for the screwdriver set. He said, "You're a little hustler, aren't you?" in a way that didn't sound like an insult. I was 14. I didn't know the word arbitrage yet, but I understood that value lives in the gap between what people know and what they need to know. High school smelled like new gym floors and old pencil shavings. I wore the same gray hoodie until the elbows thinned to a map of my days. In sophomore computer club, a blonde kid named Trent said, "Pierce, you're good, but you're not fast," which is the kind of comment that aims your whole life by accident. I started timing myself. I learned the right click in my sleep. I set a kitchen timer and practiced installing RAM in the dark. On Friday nights, when the house was quiet except for my mother's true crime shows, I built a tiny empire on eBay, flipping film cameras nobody wanted anymore to kids who discovered that grain made you feel like a director. The PayPal balance climbed like a child's height marks on a door jamb. The first girl who made me forget my passwords was named Maya. She worked part-time at the coffee shop whose walls were so close they made conversation feel important. She had a wrist tattoo of a paper plane and laughed in a way that opened her whole face, like an apology for every time she'd ever been quiet. I told her about capacitors because that's what I knew. She told me about Polaroids because that's what she loved. We were both 17 and under the impression that waiting for a picture to appear is a metaphor for patience. It was, but not for the reason we thought. I got into a state college with a server room that sounded like rain on a metal roof. In the dorm, my roommate Marcus taped a sheet over the window to block the light from the campus quad fountain that refused to sleep. He wrote code at 2 a.m. in boxer shorts, murmuring to himself like a guy disarming something. We pooled our pizza money and bought domain names like we were planting flags in a future we couldn't see yet. After class, I stood in the lab where the air blew cold to keep the machines calm and felt something inside me go quiet too. It was the quiet of work that fits. Sophomore year, while everyone else discovered microbreweries and the semester abroad in Florence, Marcus and I built a little thing to compress images faster for online stores. We noticed that pages with 3-second loads hemorrhaged impatient shoppers. A white paper said shaving 100 milliseconds could lift conversions by a sliver that mattered when you multiplied it by millions of visits. We didn't have millions. We had a rusty Dell server and a heat sink that kept slipping off like a tired hat. We built anyway. We told stores we could make their pictures load before people changed their minds. Some said yes. Some asked who else had said yes. 2 yes led to 4. 4 to 8. 8 to 20. A professor who wore suit jackets with patches on the elbows told me, "Speed is a kindness," and I wrote it on a post-it and stuck it to the monitor until the dry adhesive went to dust. I met Claire at a pitch night where the beer was free, but judgment wasn't. She had a habit of listening without blinking. When I tripped on my own slides and said something about compression ratios that only we cared about, she said, "I don't invest in features. I invest in people who can make a market." She asked what I believed that others did not. I said, "That latency is a class issue. Bad internet makes poor people wait longer." She looked at me for an extra beat, maybe to see if I meant it. I did. She introduced me to Elena, who wore a navy blazer as if it were an exoskeleton, and asked, "What happens when Amazon builds this?" "Honesty is an accelerant." I said, "We serve the companies who don't want to be Amazon." She said, "That's all of them," and smiled the exact amount that meant we were getting a check. We moved out of the apartment where the carpet smelled like older students and into an office we shared with a dentist who played saxophone at lunch. Our first full-time hire was June, who asked questions like chisels. The second was a system administrator named Luis who could make a server farm hum like a well-fed fridge and who once hot-swapped a drive while whistling a tune that didn't exist yet. We named the company Hinge because I like metaphors and because Pivot was taken. The first logo was a mistake born of a free trial of vector software and my inability to let go of gradients. At night, when the last train moaned past the building, I stayed to vacuum around the chairs because I couldn't stand the crinkle of potato chips under wheels in the morning. Power is a room where you notice the trash. The first crisis had a smell, melted plastic, and the sharp sweetness of a blown capacitor. The server room ran hot that July. Our landlord said the building's chiller had personnel issues, which turned out to mean a guy named Bernie was in Florida. We pulled in every fan we could find. Elena stripped to a t-shirt and fanned the racks with a binder. June was on the phone with a client who had just landed their first big celebrity collab and did not want a homepage that loaded like a shy turtle. We throttled, cached, begged, and prayed, each to a different god. At dawn, hummingbirds were arguing over the hibiscus outside the loading dock. The air smelled like new day and old coffee. We slept on yoga mats we bought for an office wellness initiative we didn't have time for, and woke to the sound of the building breathing again. Later, someone sent around a clip about a German data center where a technician had crashed a whole rack by leaning on the emergency power-off button. I learned that the history of infrastructure is written in tiny human mistakes followed by large human forgiveness. We survived on bagels and spite. Then we discovered logistics. Not the Instagram version, with warehouse drones posing in hard hats. The actual engine of civilization, full of clipboards and forklifts and paper forms still carbon-copied in triplicate because the software was written when bell-bottoms were unironic. A friend at a mid-size retailer confessed their container ship had been delayed at the port of Los Angeles because nobody knew exactly what paperwork had to be in whose email at what time. "It's like Kafka with forklifts," he said. We plugged into their system, and it felt like fishing blind in a black river and catching a chandelier. Shipments, routes, port holds, customs. It was all data, and most of it was asleep. We woke it up. We built dashboards that told people what had already happened in time to do something about it. We shaved hours off and called it a day, then weeks off and called it a revolution. It turned out the same intuition that made website images load fast could also move sneakers across the Pacific without disappearing for a month in transit limbo. Globalization had a smell too, diesel and salt, and the faint sweetness of container paint baked in the sun. I learned that half the world's goods spend some part of their lives inside a corrugated steel box, and that the box was one of the quiet inventions that rewired the planet, like the shipping pallet or standardized screw threads. I learned that ports are cities within cities, with their own cops and myths, and that a longshoreman named Al could teach you more about resilience than any panel at a tech conference. We pivoted Hinge into that world with all the grace of a dog on an icy sidewalk, but we made it, because we were too stubborn to fall. The second crisis didn't smell like anything because it was a slow leak, a lawsuit from a competitor who thought their best strategy was to bury us in paper. The first day the box of filings arrived, June put her hand on the lid as if it might bite. Our lawyers smiled in the way doctors do when they are about to ask you to say ah. We fought. We won, then lost, then settled, which is another way of saying we agreed to stop bleeding at the price of a scar. Somewhere in there, life tried to be a life. Maya moved to Portland to photograph bands who read books. She called once and said, "You make the world smaller. I'm trying to make it bigger." I said, "Maybe the size doesn't matter if what's inside is honest." She said, "That's a fridge magnet, Evan." And we both laughed because she was right and because laughter is a sandbag. We wished each other well in the way people do when they want to be kind and also free. Claire introduced us to the kind of money that has initials. We sat across from people whose watches cost more than the cars we used to drive, and I told them a story about light and speed and steel boxes and patience. I learned to speak in charts. I learned to leave the last slide black so the eye could rest. Elena negotiated terms with the calm of a park bench. After the wire hit, we bought chairs that didn't wobble and benefits that let our people go to the dentist without doing math first. We painted a wall with whiteboard paint and wrote, in thick blue letters, "Make the hidden visible." Luis added, underneath, "Also label your cables, for the love of God." Because culture is what survives your aspirational poster. I went to Shenzhen and learned that gravity has a schedule. If you put a thing on a boat at noon on Thursday, it will arrive when history and weather and labor and policy all agree, and not a minute earlier. In Nairobi, a logistics manager told me how mobile money had let her pay a driver who used to wait days for a paper check to float. In a Detroit warehouse, a guy named Reggie showed me a forklift battery the size of a coffin and said, "We keep going when the charge says no," which I wrote down and read later and decided none of my product copy would ever be as good as that sentence. I talked to a woman in Ohio named Denise whose job was to print labels with a dinosaur of a laser printer that had outlived 3 supervisors. I asked if she liked the new system. She shrugged and said, "It doesn't crash and make me feel stupid," which was the best product review we'd ever gotten. Some nights, the office emptied and I sat at a window that looked out over a rail yard where the trains sighed like tired animals. The sun made a last gold stripe across the tracks, and then the city shifted into its nighttime self. I thought about the weird luck of having been born into a century that made it possible to be no one in the morning and important by dinner if you caught the right wind, and how that wind often looked like work to everyone except the person doing it. I thought about my father and his hinges, and about how I now moved doors I couldn't see. There were women who touched the story in brushstrokes that don't belong to anyone else, and I try to honor them with the right distance. There was Rachel, a journalist who asked questions with a softness that made you tell the truth. She caught me once after a panel edgewise and said, "You seem like someone who pretends not to be nervous." I replied, "You seem like someone who pretends not to care," and she smiled because that was fair. We had coffee in a city where the sidewalks were still wet from a recent ambition. She liked that I could talk about containerization one minute and a documentary about Japanese lacquer the next. I liked that she returned my texts in lowercase. She wrote a piece that was kinder than it needed to be and then moved on because that was her job and because timing is another word for fate. There was Aisha, a supply chain director with a laugh that traveled, who taught me more about labor contracts than any consultant ever did, and who once said, under buzzing warehouse lights, "Don't say you empower people if you can't explain how payroll works." I wrote that on the wall too. Money changes the air. It makes rooms smell like leather and new carpet. It fills your email with acquaintances. When I crossed my first 100 million, the bank sent a fruit basket and an embossed letter I didn't understand. Someone at a dinner asked me if I felt different. I said, "Not at breakfast." The truth is that money doesn't change your appetite. It changes your pantry. You can buy better coffee. You still make it wrong sometimes because your mind is elsewhere. In the year the world coughed and closed, our dashboard lit up like a Christmas display. Routes broke. Ports paused. People hoarded flour in freezers. We became a seismograph for a planet's anxiety. We could see, in a line, how a factory shutting in Vietnam meant a store shelf in Cincinnati stood empty 3 weeks later. Our models strained and held. I went on television from a spare bedroom with a bookshelf I rearranged to look like a person who reads for pleasure, and told a host with perfect hair that patience was a supply chain too. Afterward, my mother called to say I should sit up straighter. We opened a small office in a building that used to be a cereal factory. We chose it because the freight elevator could swallow a conference table and because a pigeon had built a nest on the ledge outside the room we later named after Grace Hopper. I hired a therapist for the company, quietly, as part of benefits, because I finally understood that the way you move freight is by moving people, and people are made of nerves. June built a team under her that looked like a festival poster. Everybody different, everybody fierce. We banned the phrase, work family, because we believed in boundaries. We bought good headphones and cheap plants. Trent, the high school blonde who once told me I wasn't fast, showed up again as a founder at a competitor funded by a fund so large it seemed fictional. He sent a text that said, "Small world," which I read as, "I see you." We danced around the same contracts, two hawks circling the same field. He once leaked a memo that tried to paint us as indifferent to labor issues. It hurt because it was unfair and because fairness is a rule you only notice when it breaks. We responded not with a flame, but with a policy and invited union reps to a panel we didn't control. Elena said, "They will remember that we listened." I don't know if they did. I do know that sleep came easier that week. The night before our first acquisition closed, I ate a hamburger at a diner that smelled like bacon had been living there since the Carter administration. My hands shook a little, the way they did when I held a soldering iron at 13. We were buying a company that was older than me, full of people who had been told their way of keeping track. Paper, phone calls, memory was obsolete. I told their founder, a man named Walter who wore his hearing aid like a badge, that we would not replace anyone who didn't want to be replaced. He said, "Son, everybody gets replaced. Make it kind." He taught me how to read a manifest like jazz. There were years when the company grew like humidity, everywhere, all at once, and years when it grew like a hairline, reluctantly. The line on the wall behind my desk showed quarters in an almost arrogant diagonal. We planned an IPO. We rehearsed the bell ringing without bells, practicing smiles that didn't look practiced. We hired a media trainer who taught me how to answer a question without answering it, and I immediately resolved to answer every question a little too directly, for spite, for sport, for the relief of being a person. The night before the filing, our SOC detected an anomaly. A few alarms always blinked. This one screamed. Our risk vendor's SDK, one we relied on to verify carriers, had been compromised upstream. Nothing exfiltrated, nothing touched, but the logic tree that decided who could pick up thousands of shipments had brushed against a contaminated branch. In the worst scenario, a bad actor could have redirected loads, stolen goods, created chaos in the kind of systems where chaos and hunger share a thin wall. For hours, we traced. We mapped. We isolated. I stood there listening to the fluorescent hum while Naomi printed, Elena called, and June stared at lines on a screen as if she could will them into confessing. At 2:19 a.m., a junior engineer named Paolo, who wore socks with cartoon owls, found the exact commit where the SDK's hash went sideways. He said, "Here," in a voice that sounded like he'd just opened a door and discovered a field. We cut, patched, and messaged. It was not a breach. It was a brush, a near. But near is enough to change a man's posture. At 3:11 a.m., with sun still an hour from watercoloring the facades, I looked at the draft of our disclosure and the emails that vibrated with the specific anxiety of a market that wants someone else to go first. We could file. We could hold. We could invite 1,000 strangers to own a piece of us, while I wasn't sure if anything I owned belonged to me except the choice about what to say. Naomi tilted her head the way she does when she's putting her weight behind a recommendation. "We tell them," she said. "We tell them now, and if they don't want us because we tell them, we don't want them." The room was not a church. It felt like one anyway. I typed. We identified and remediated an upstream vendor compromise. No customer data accessed. No operational impact. We are reviewing all third-party code with independent auditors. We will hold our listing until the review is complete. 5 sentences. 10 years. Send. The thing about a pause is that it feels like a cliff even when it's a step. The phone lit with replies that used words like prudence and disappointing in the same breath. Claire wrote, proud. Elena exhaled in a way that flattened a small circle of papers. Paolo cried quietly into his sleeve and then apologized for crying, and June told him, please don't apologize for being a person, and he nodded and then laughed because life insists on being funny at least once per catastrophe. I walked down to the lobby and pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the revolving door and watched my breath bloom on the pane. The delay cost us. Of course it did. The market is a mood ring you can't wear for long without getting a rash. A week later, a senator whose staffer had sent concerns invited me to testify at a hearing whose title made us sound like an apocalypse. I sat there under lights that turned fresh faces to wax and said that the future will be built with borrowed code and that we must teach young companies to check the locks on every window, even the ones they didn't install. Afterward, a staffer with the posture of a violin said my answer was refreshingly human, and I thought about the cost of sounding like a brochure. We listed a month later. The bell was less a bell than an idea of a bell, but it rang anyway, and the air filled with confetti of our ticker symbol and with a peculiar sense of both arrival and departure. My mother stood with me, wearing a blouse she called fancy. She looked around and said, all these people came to see you? I said, they came to see a story, and she squeezed my hand and said, well, tell them the truth then. People think the number in a headline is a destination. It is a mirror that shows you every person who helped you walk into the room. It shows you Marcus, who left to start a company whose product makes welding safer, and who sends me photos of his kids with welding helmets on at Halloween. It shows you Maya, who published a book of photographs of old diners and newer faces, and who wrote on the flyleaf, speed is a kindness. Slowness is, too. It shows you Denise and her printer that doesn't crash. It shows you Al at the port who taught me how to read the water. It shows you Naomi and Elena and June and Luis and Paolo and Claire and Reggie and Walter and Rachel and Aisha, and my father with his aluminum knuckles, and my mother with her candle emoji. The other day, I visited one of our warehouses incognito, which is to say I wore a hoodie and carried a clipboard and tried to look like a guy whose back hurts for noble reasons. A new hire named Tyler showed me how to load a pallet in a way that won't make the shrink wrap tear. He did not know who I was, and it felt like clean air. He said, we used to just kind of guess, but now this screen tells me what to do, and I feel less stupid if I get it wrong. He didn't mean the screen made him smart. He meant it made the job kinder. I thought about the ways technology is a rumor we spread about ourselves, and about the rare days when the rumor is true. Another fact, a standard shipping container can be stacked up to 9 high on a ship, which means fear and hope can sail together in layers and not know each other's names. Another, the COBOL that runs parts of the government still hums despite everyone predicting its death since before I learned to talk. Another, a single digit in a tariff code can change the path of 1,000,000 toothbrushes. Another, some warehouses paint skylights blue so workers think the day is brighter than it is. Another, the yellow on a forklift isn't random. It's tuned to be seen in peripheral vision when your mind is elsewhere. The world is full of such tiny accommodations, and building Hinge taught me to love them out loud. At home, I live in a house that used to be a bakery. The kitchen smells like ghosts of cinnamon on rainy mornings. There's a door in the floor that leads to a crawl space where the previous owner stored flour in tins that now hold the things I don't want to look at yet. Old laptops, a broken clock, a shoebox of notes from a time before money. On my coffee table sits the router I rebuilt at 14, the one Terry bought while wincing. I bought it back on eBay with my own money and didn't tell anyone because some stories are for you alone. The plastic is yellowed and the logo peeling. When the afternoon sun hits it, the dust dances above it like applause. Some evenings I walk to the pier and eat a paper boat of fries that drip vinegar onto my fingers. I watch teenagers leap from the lower rail into water the color of stubbornness, and I imagine their phones waiting on towels like obedient dogs. I listen to gulls argue and think about how every system we build is a guess at tomorrow. The company is large now in the way whales are large, slow to turn, majestic when it matters, easily misunderstood by people who've only seen the pictures. We make mistakes. We name them. We do not pretend that naming heals the wound, but we believe that not naming makes it fester. Somewhere, a truck leaves a dock with a pallet of something nobody ever writes poetry about and arrives in time for a kid's birthday, or a clinic's delivery window, or a diner's breakfast rush, and I feel connected to that in a way that makes sleep kinder. The headline numbers come and go. Stock ticks are a nervous habit you can quit. I still wake sometimes at 3:11 a.m. and listen to the house hum and feel my thumb hover over a decision that isn't there. I get up, pad to the kitchen, drink water that tastes like clarity, and look out at a city that never fully decides to sleep. Somewhere, a janitor pushes a cart across a lobby, and a fluorescent light hums, and a kid in a basement in a Midwest nowhere listens to the tremolo of a modem and imagines a hinge that could move a door he hasn't found yet. If I could send him anything, it would be the sentence I wrote on a post-it once, and the way my father said it without knowing he was founding a religion for one boy. Small parts change the big thing. I don't know what we build next. Maybe something that makes returns less awful, or customs less opaque, or trucks less lonely. Maybe something not about freight at all. The trick, I think, is to keep the screw threads standard and the promises specific. To hire people who make you a beginner again, and to sit with the discomfort long enough to ask a better question. To answer the phone when your mother calls to ask why your suit looked wrinkly on television. To buy good boots and stand in the places your software touches. To listen at doors and tell the truth about hinges. To pause, even when the market wants motion, and to choose the sentence that makes tomorrow easier for a person you will never meet. It's late again. The light above my kitchen island makes a small telescope out of my glass of water. I can hear the wind push against the old windows. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard shrugs. I have learned that endings are a matter of tone. You don't slam the door. You let it settle against the frame with that soft, satisfying sound that says the latch found the strike plate and everyone is safe inside. Tomorrow we'll ask for another sentence. I'll write it 5 words at a time if I have to, because I remember the feeling of hot plastic and dust and a screen waking in the dark, and I still believe that if I stay up long enough and listen to the hum, I can find the next hinge and move the next door.